Welcome back to season 3 of Neranenah Scholars. Thanks so much for tuning in. We hope you enjoyed last week's episode and that you'll enjoy this week's episode too. Thanks so much. When you got into comedy, I'm guessing you were just funny always, but were you a fan of like the history of comedy before that and things like that?
I was really funny, but yes, I listened to Joan Rivers.
Mhm.
She had this album when I was in high school, What Makes a Semi-Legend Most. I mean, I had that memorized. And it was women comics that really had an effect on me. Toady Fields,
Mm.
um, Phyllis Diller,
Mm.
Moms Mabley. But there was something about Joan because she was so brash and she was so unapologetic and fearless and talked about she talked about things that no one was talking about. And she was telling the truth. And not only did I find her, brash and hilarious, so did my parents. And my mother's like, she went to Barnard and she's very smart, and and the fact that she was, here's this guy from Nebraska hosting this couldn't be whiter or more geisha, right?
Mm-hmm.
And he is so enamored with her, and she is just cracking him up,
Mm-hmm.
It was fascinating to me. Oh, you can behave like that. Toady Fields was so physical, and so self-deprecating. I loved Carol Burnett. I would watch Laugh-In. I loved sitcoms. I loved Rhoda Morgenstern. It was, and of course, Barbra Streisand. There's every Jewish girl loves Barbra Streisand, but I was looking for representation, because there is this idea of the, obnoxious Jewish woman, the Yenta.
Mm-hmm.
And then there are those RBGs, those people who change the world.
Yeah.
So I feel like, we're multi-dimensional, but it was when I was looking, I loved Richard Pryor. Unfortunately, Bill Cosby. But George Carlin, but I really was drawn to the women. And the women who were not polite. And I loved Elaine Boozler. I thought she was great. It was when I was in high school and I saw these sort of women coming up. There weren't a lot, and then someone dared me to do stand-up. I was like, oh, I loved music so much. You ask me, well, that was my natural path because it was like something I loved so much. But when I did my first stand-up set, it was really an epiphany. And I think there are so many comics who are musicians because it is, a pause. A pause can screw up a joke. I said a syllable can screw up a joke. Someone interrupts you in the middle of a setup, a tag. It's so, if you compared comedians' notebooks, in a way, it's sort of, here's the melody, you put a little notation, and then it is so, they are so connected.
Wow. Yeah. Do you know Clark Terry, the trumpet player? Are you familiar with his name?
Should I act like I know all the people that you mentioned?
I shouldn't even ask it like that. Well,
no, I don't know. No, I don't know.
He's a great old trumpet player who kind of mentored Quincy Jones. And he said that the process to learning jazz is imitate, assimilate, innovate. Can you relate to that with comedy? It's just finding your voice.
I don't think you can imitate. Assimilate is really a great I think there's a bit of that. And integrate, yes, absolutely. But you can't, you got the thing about stand-up is you have to have your own voice. But if I do look at, it's funny, if I were to go through the history of comedy and I'd say, here's this comedian, and I go back 50 years, I could find a comedian who's similar in their presentation or whatever. But assimilate, I always think, and that's such a Jewish word too, assimilate,
Yeah.
And I think in comedy, I always say, you don't want to get on stage and act like you're, more cosmopolitan, more intelligent, more anything. And I always say, look at the local newscasters of the town you're going to. And that is what people wear. And that's how people look in that area. I always say, if you want to know how to dress for a gig, look at the local newscasters so that you don't feel, because you want them, comedy is disarming and you want them to like you. And so when you get on stage, the first thing they see, first thing that comes out of your mouth is so important. And sort of how you present yourself.
Oh yeah. Well, I guess like with like honing your craft, both musically and comedy. With music, you can just practice. I guess with comedy, I mean, you just have to, I'm guessing you have to practice in front of people all the time. It won't.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. The thing about stand-up, especially, stand-up comedy in particular, is, it's like you have a melody or you have an idea, and then you can't get better at the only way to get better at stand-up is to be on stage. You can get better at your instrument by staying at home and practicing. But it's the only art form where the audience informs you and tells you what's good and what's not good. And it's like, I say this a lot. You don't, a muralist, an artist doesn't paint, a third of a mural and then invite an audience over to say, what do you think of the tree here? Huh? Or should I move the horse to the other? It doesn't happen. And there's so many times where I'm sitting here at my desk and I'm like, oh my God, I can't wait to tell this. I have an idea. I can't wait to talk about it on stage. And then I get on stage and it's like, and I'm like, really? Are you kidding? But it is, we need the audience. And also, Joe, this is the other thing. The rhythm, once you get into your zone and you've got the audience and you're doing your act and everyone has different timing and a different pace, once you're in that give and take, it is so rhythmic. You don't always start the next joke. The audience tells you when it's time to start the next joke. When, I will start a new joke at the tail end of a laugh. Some people will wait till they're all done laughing, make it a little uncomfortable. And, and that's the other thing with the timing is the rhythm. And so when we were doing Zoom shows over the pandemic, there was none of that. And I remember doing a show in Israel. I was here in New York and then they were in Israel. And I remember they're like, oh, the show's at 9:00. And I'm like, oh, okay. And then I realized that was Israel time. So that was great. It was in the afternoon. But I remember I had a gallery of people and you couldn't really, they were muted because Jews on Zoom during a comedy show, unmuted, not good.
Yeah.
And so I remember thinking, how am I going to know when to start the next joke? I can't. And there was one woman who thought I was hilarious. And I saw her in the corner. And every time I told a joke, she would go like this at the punchline.
That's great.
And when she got up, I knew it's time. She would go back, forward, and up, and I go, okay, now it's time to say the next joke. And so you need that. And also
Mhm.
when you go to perform,
Mhm.
um do you say to the other musicians, maybe if someone does a set before you, how's the room?
Yeah.
How are they? Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, you can.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and we do the same thing. We're like, how are they? Um the pace of your jokes,
Mm.
are they listening? Are you getting their attention? Are you, like in a theater, they're already ready to listen. So you're,
Mhm.
in a theater situation, you want to keep their attention. In a
Mhm.
comedy club, you want to get their attention,
Mm.
because there's too many distractions. But
Mm.
it depends on the room, and you're constantly editing up there, editing,
Mhm.
um
Yeah. I like to walk on stage with a list of songs that I could choose
right,
from and see who the audience is before I pick it. It was really hard on
right,
Zoom because I didn't really know who it was all the time at all.
right, exactly.
Yeah.
Where's
It's
I don't have my notebook here, but that's what I have. I have these cards. Like,
mm.
I'll write out, just like you do. You write out, I'm going to do this, this, and this. And once you're up there, you're like, oh, they didn't like that, so they're not going to
Mm.
like that. So, you know,
Yeah.
while you're talking, while you're performing, it's um and also just that idea of, being in real time and
Mhm.
dealing with whatever's happening in the room.
Mhm. Did you ever have any like I had a lot of gigs that some people would call wallpaper gigs where you're just in the background
Oh
playing?
my God.
You had a lot of
And for
those?
comedy, it's the worst.
I love that.
I did lunchrooms of colleges where they're
Oh,
just
wow.
literally going to eat their meals, and there I am like, "Hey, what's going on?" And, and this was years and I mean 30 years ago, whatever, but
Mm.
you would take any gig, anything to get on
Mhm.
stage.
Yeah.
I've
Mhm.
done street fairs where people are just walking by.
Mm.
Um, you know, outdoor events where people come and go.
Mm.
It's just, yeah, it's such a, it's a list, comedy, you have to really listen because you
Mhm.
need to hear every word. So it's
Right.
really hard to do a wallpaper gig.
Yeah.
But there are wallpaper gigs. You
Mm.
stand over here and tell jokes, and then there are going to be people over here doing. It's like, no.
Mm.
But we're
I
one above strippers, comics, stand up.
I did a lot of those wallpaper gigs, and it took a while to figure out, even though it makes sense, how to quiet people. I thought if I play, all eating dinner. If I play louder, they got to get quiet, but they actually get louder. And then when I play
Oh,
quieter, they
but
get
and that's
quiet.
the same with stand up. If they're
Yeah.
talking really loud, you grab the mic and you start talking like this, and
Mm.
they will start listening
Mm.
to what you're saying.
I,
And
I,
I think it's true with people too, because I'll say something in public and my kids will be like, "Mommy, shut up." They heard you. I'm like, "No, they didn't hear me because I was talking normally." So they don't think it's about them if I was talking
mm.
like that, you know.
Yeah. I heard the
Everyone
best
wants to know
story.
what you
I heard the greatest story about learning to quiet an audience. The pianist George Shearing, who was blind, he was playing at this club called the London House in Chicago back in like the 60s. And apparently the room was hushed except for the table in the front. And Shearing had like a pretty good sense of humor. I don't know if he was asked one time if he had been blind all his life, and he said, not yet. But at this, it was good. But at this show, he's playing, and the room is hushed except for the table right in the front, and the place is trying to listen, so they're shushing the table, and you hear the music, but you hear this rising level of shh, you know. And finally,
right.
finally, Shearing, he's playing, but finally he stops and he picks up the mic and he says to the audience, he goes, "I'm playing as quietly as I can."
Oh, that's
And
hilarious.
he did it with humor. I've seen people do it in a mean way, and they lose everyone because they're not rooting for
Right,
him.
right.
Yeah.
That's the thing about comedy. You can say
Mm.
anything. You get
Mm.
your point across,
Mm.
and it's not sort of, I don't know, people don't feel abused, or, it's not antagonistic in a way,
Mhm. Yeah. Well, do you have a definition for Jewish comedy, or like not a definition, but what you'd say is Jewish comedy?
Um, there definitely is Jewish comedy. First of all,
Hmm.
think about, I don't know if there's a specific definition,
Hmm.
but when you think of a Jewish comic,
Hmm.
when you think of a Jewish guy comic, you think of a Nebish, you
Hmm.
think of a Woody Allen, you think,
Hmm. Hmm.
and when you think of a female Jewish comic, you think of, like a loud, obnoxious. So that is also the stereotype of the, Jewish woman versus the Jewish guy.
Mm.
And I mean, comedy is such a part, I think it's uniquely American,
Mhm.
stand up. I think it's very American because of our First Amendment rights that are, going down the toilet right now.
Mm.
I think it's a immigrant, um you think of these people coming here and having this unique view of the world and
Mhm.
using humor to get people to like them. That's why there's so many marginalized, um people with marginalized, backgrounds,
Mm.
who are comedians. We see the world, we see different things. The curse of the comedian, I think,
Mm.
is that we notice everything. And
Mhm.
it's sometimes I'm like, ugh, I wish I didn't notice that. But
Mm.
we really read people. We're definitely social commentators.
Mhm.
Um, but the Jews, think about it. Borscht Belt, um, sitcoms, Norman Lear, theater, Neil Simon. You know, we, you think about the producers. The producers is a perfect um example of, you know, using humor as a weapon.
Mhm.
Um and we didn't have a lot of weapons, and I think
Mhm.
Jews know how to use it as a weapon. It's
Mhm.
also a coping mechanism. It also makes people like us. And I think the thing about Jewish humor is, I think I've said this before to you, that you
Mm.
think of a bar or bat mitzvah, right?
Mhm.
Which is, okay, here's your Torah portion, you're going to recite it, and then you're going to give a speech
Mhm.
about, um how this is unique to you.
Mhm.
Okay. So here's a portion of the Torah that people have been arguing over for thousands of years, and we want you to have another take on it. And that's what comedy
Mhm.
is. It's like, it's a surprise. It's like, oh, I never saw it that way.
Mhm.
And we are a thinking person's religion. We are an asking questions. It's not all one way.
Mhm.
It's not like the Pope says, okay, this is how it's going to go now. It's like
Mhm.
we question and question and
Mhm.
then like the whole Torah is full of, and you didn't know, and he questioned, and um, and I think that is what Jewish humor is that is really, seeing aspects of things that you never really put married together.
Mm. Yeah. Mhm. It's interesting. I was reading an interview with Mel Brooks recently. Have you seen any of
Oh,
his?
Mel Brooks. I forgot to
Yeah.
say Mel Brooks.
Oh, well, but it was someone was asking him basically, how do you feel being like the penultimate Jewish comic or something like that? I
Right.
wrote the quote down. He says, Jewish comedy, Yiddish comedy or Jewish comedy has to do with Jewish folklore, Shalom Aleichem, that kind of stuff. The mistakenly called Jewish comedy of the great comics was really New York. It was the streets of New York, the wise guy, the sharpness that New York gives you that you can't get anywhere else, but you can't get on the streets of Brooklyn. Jewish comedy was softer and sweeter. New York comedy was tougher and more explosive. There's some cruelty that you find in New York humor that you wouldn't find in Yiddish humor. In New York, You make fun of somebody who walks funny. You never find that in Shalom Aleichem. You'd feel pity. There's no pity in New York. There's reality and a brushstroke of brutality in it. So he was saying he's really a New York. I mean, what's your takeaway from that? Do you like it?
It's funny that he says that because, the most anti-Semitic thing you hear as a comic when you're trying to get booked without them saying they're Jewish and I hate Jews is, oh, they're too New York. They're too New York. And that's the key to, that's the, what's it called? The safe word for anti-Semites, when they say, oh, they're a New York comedian. So, yeah, I think, Yiddish comedy, you look at the Marx Brothers, hilarious. I mean, they were hilarious. And you look at their jokes, or their bits, and you see them done over and over. There's a National Comedy Museum. And they have this, I think it's a permanent installation where you see a visual joke and where it originated, and then it shows you how many more times it's been used in modern times. And there's the Marx Brothers. It's amazing. There's one where they're the slipping on the banana peel. That started with them. They're playing football. And they're, of course, the guys are huge, and they're like, and he's got the football, so he throws banana peels, and all the big guys are falling, and he gets a touchdown. This idea of conquering, this David and Goliath thing. That's so much of it. But yes, there's Yiddish comedy. There's, but I think it did morph as we evolved and we could say more things. But there's so many things I do for Jewish audiences. There's just an unspoken, yeah, we got it, and that's comforting in a way, to go, oh, you're my people. I know exactly how to make you laugh. And then there's the rest of the world, and you have to be who you are and also make them laugh, but not laugh at you for, or laugh for the wrong reason. That's the that's where it goes awry, when they're laughing for the wrong reason.
Do you agree with Lenny Bruce that chocolate is Jewish and fudge is Goyish? Do you know his quote about that?
No, I didn't. I've studied him. What? Tell me.
Let me read you this quote. He says, "To me, if you live in New York or any other big city, you are Jewish. It doesn't matter even if you're Catholic. If you live in New York, you're Jewish. If you live in Butte, Montana, you're going to be Goyish even if you're Jewish. Evaporated milk is Goyish even if the Jews invented it. Chocolate is Jewish and fudge is Goyish. Spam is Goyish and rye bread is Jewish. Negroes are all Jews. Italians are all Jews. Irishmen who have rejected their religion are Jews. Mouths are very Jewish, and bosoms. Baton twirling is Goyish. George Jessel and Danny Thomas are Christians, because if you look very closely on their bodies, you'll find a boil somewhere." I mean, it's just the whole thing.
It's all true. I believe every word of that. Yeah.
I love comparing Lenny Bruce to Bob Dylan, because I feel like, correct me if I'm wrong, but like, I feel like before Bob Dylan, it was the Brill Building era, and everyone was writing songs for other people. And then Dylan came around, and he kind of like, you had to write your own songs. You had to tell your truth, even if it wasn't the truth. Would you say like Lenny Bruce was kind of the start of like, you're speaking from your personal experience?
I don't know if he's, Gene Carroll, who was the first real female Jewish comedian, who was I think she was in vaudeville, and then she was funny. She was funny in between the songs. And she wrote amazing jokes. And I know that, Alan King and all those guys were like, oh, she's like a guy comic, because she had all this great material. But she talked about herself. I think so many women, Jewish women, would get on stage, I'd say, and be like, listen, I know I should be at home. They had to say something to say, I know my place, but here's my material. You know, like
Mm,
Sophie Tucker, you think, you know, these women have been through so much shit that
mm,
they were like, you know what? I don't care anymore. You know, you're
mm,
not gonna, and not ladylike. You know, you look at these, there's waspy women are not, you know, like, ooh, I mean, there's nothing funny about them.
yeah.
But Lenny Bruce, I think and the Smothers Brothers and George Carlin,
Mhm.
and Dick Gregory, and there are so many who were more social commentators. And then what happened with Lenny was he was getting arrested for using curse words
Mhm.
that everyone used in their house, but um they really wanted him on the substance of his material, that he was talking about segregation and the Vietnam War and the government and all that. And that's where, but they got him with the cursing.
Mm,
And you know, he, at the end, he wasn't funny because he was reading all, like, can you believe this is happening to me? It wasn't funny anymore because he
mhm.
was. And you think about him, and you think about Carlin, who also got arrested, and you think about these people who were really, and you know, and Pryor,
Mm,
who really pushed the envelope, and Joan, you know.
mhm.
And you see that now, you know, it's like, what would they be thinking now? It's
Yeah.
crazy
Mm, yeah, they're
that it hasn't
heroic.
changed that much, you know.
Mm, yeah, they're like heroic pioneers. I mean, really.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
Um, I was listening to Mark Maron talk about the Jewish thing, and he thought the Jewish thing is really kind of what you were saying earlier about the rhythm, how people spoke. And he
Yeah.
also said he feels like the Jewish rhythm has basically become a now definable part of what is now American comedy. So it's hard to tell the difference between what's Jewish and
Right,
American.
right.
It's
Well, there's your assimilate. Because
right,
you know
right.
what? We're funny. So you can't deny it. And then people, you know.
Yeah, it reminded me. Have you heard the Philip Roth quote about Irving Berlin? He said, "With Easter parade, Berlin turned Easter into a holiday about fashion, and then with White Christmas, he turned Christmas into a holiday about snow."
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
Exactly.
yeah. It's,
Um, yeah, go ahead.
I don't know. It's really interesting because with this festival, I'll talk to a lot of Jewish musicians, and they'll say, "I'm Jewish, but I mean, my music has nothing to do with But then I talk to a lot of comedians, and it seems to be the opposite. It's almost like
Oh, absolutely.
what is that? I mean, what's the why? I mean, do you see any? I don't know what the question is exactly, but why
Yeah.
do you think Jewish musicians don't embrace it and Jewish comedians? It's almost a bragging
I
thing, right?
Right. I think it's my being Jewish. First of all, you know, for so many years I you know, and I'm actually recording an album soon about it's all my mother jokes about my mother.
Oh man.
And which were the funniest jokes I had. I mean, she was hilarious. And there's this thing about the Jewish mother.
Mm,
And we all had a Jewish mother. That here, and people would say, is your mother upset? And I'm
mhm,
like, my mother, no. There's this sort of, no matter what you do, they're gonna love you, you
mm,
know, they
mhm,
love you. And you feel safe.
mm,
And how many times are you in a, you know, you're at a Jewish gathering and it's like everyone's shouting and you always say, you know, and there's this
mm,
and it's very musical. Um and yet it's the way we communicate with each other, you know.
mhm,
We don't hold stuff in. I mean, we
mhm,
definitely have secrets, for sure.
mhm.
um but we say what we think. and
Yeah.
and and great comics speak truth to power. And I had a mother who spoke up.
Mm,
um I speak up. I'll say, what do you mean, you know, like, you challenge we challenge people. We
totally.
don't, you know, eh, it's the it's that Goyisha waspy, well, you know, I mean,
Mm,
I
Well, it's like
see
the
it
scene in
all the
Annie Hall
time.
comparing the dinners, the two
Right.
family dinners. To
Right,
me.
right, exactly. You
Mm.
know, we're not polite, but you know what? We've been kicked out of everywhere we've lived. What do you want from us? You know?
Yeah.
Okay, because if we were docile and we did keep our mouth shut, we wouldn't even be here.
Thanks so much for tuning in. We hope you enjoyed this week's episode. Great programming like this is only possible because of supporters like you. So if you're interested in supporting Neranenah, please visit us online at neranenahArts.org. Thanks so much.